Britt, thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate it. Do you mind answering a couple questions?
Of course, my pleasure.
So can you give us a timeline of your reporting on DKE and for the past few months and kind of what the major events have been?
Right, yeah, of course. So it goes back roughly about a month. It was in early January that DKE first reached out to us, which is pretty interesting, right? This all kind of began with DKE reaching out to the Yale Daily News saying, hey, like, we think that there's a story coming up for you guys. Our national organization is going to be investigating us to help us improve our culture because we've recently been notified of several allegations about sexual misconduct and an unhealthy atmosphere within our fraternity, which, as it would turn out, had come from Business Insider. So I was on that story. I began looking into it, and quickly it became apparent that part of the plot line was that last year in March, the former president of DKE, who was the president at the time, Luke Persichetti, had been suspended from Yale. He's returning at the end of this semester, but he had been suspended for quote unquote penetration without consent. He was suspended by Yale's university-wide committee on sexual misconduct, which was created actually after the last major DKE incident at Yale in 2010, 2011, like the No Means Yes chants outside of the Women's Center. It was when the Department of Education had to come into Yale, and Yale had created this body to help enforce against sexual misconduct. So this guy Luke Persichetti had been suspended, and Business Insider had contacted DKE about him, as well as another so far unnamed student in DKE who was also alleged to have sexually assaulted someone. And so after DKE was informed of this, they say that they contacted their national organization to begin investigating them, to try to be proactive about it, and then they contacted us saying this is happening, you can write a story about it. And then of course in our own reporting, it turned out that then we said well, you also need to comment on this entire Luke Persichetti business, and that was kind of the first kind of stage where it was last year Luke Persichetti was suspended from Yale. DKE is now being investigated by their nationals. They also have a working group at Yale comprised of Yale students who are going to come up with solutions and recommendations to make DKE a safer space on campus. And that's the first stage. And then after that, first article comes out from the Yale Daily News. That's the first mention of Luke Persichetti, former president, being suspended. Later that week, we have an article from Business Insider giving specific details about the alleged sexual assault that Luke Persichetti carried out, in addition to another alleged sexual assault carried out by a currently unnamed DKE member who, according to DKE, resigned after the release of the Business Insider article in about the middle of January. And then after that, we had in the Yale Daily News the two victims who alleged these two original assaults that were covered by the Yale Daily News' Business Insider. We have them calling all of DKE's actions so far a massive publicity stunt, right? Saying they are only telling the Yale Daily News about this investigation because they're trying to preempt this news cycle where it's going to come out that their former president, Luke Persichetti, was suspended for sexual assault, which is especially significant because Luke Persichetti, on the record, in an interview for a Yale Daily News article an entire year ago, said that DKE's culture was finally starting to improve underneath his tenure and just in general, because DKE, year before last, had come back to Yale after their 5-year suspension following the No Means Yes chant, pledge crisis, both for Yale and for DKE in 2010, 2011. So it looked really, really bad for them, right? And so the victims in this case were saying this is a total publicity stunt. They're not genuine at all. They're just trying to look their best.
Right.
And then in the aftermath of that was when I began working on this big story that came out earlier this week about these 8 additional allegations, right? Facing DKE, all from victims who all spoke underneath the condition of anonymity, but corroborated by friends who were with them that night, text messages that people who they first talked to about it, stuff like that. And that took about a month of reporting to really put together, because part of it was also establishing that there is an institutional cultural problem of sexual misconduct in DKE, that we can't just kind of say these are just 8 anonymous allegations, what do we do about them? But we also need to contend with the fact that we have CCEs, we have tons of FROCOs, we have sorority members, we have the neighbors on Lake Place next to DKE all saying there are definitely uncomfortable factors going on in this fraternity, especially for female students at Yale. And then kind of in between, as I was working on that article, other things happened. For example, DKE finished their working group's recommendations. They say they have been working on these since November. And those are the recommendations that if you've been reading in the articles, that's the stuff like female bartenders,
right,
like co-ed bouncers, anonymous feedback forms, DKE setting up a Facebook page, readily available water, extra non-alcoholic related activities in the backyard, several house upgrades like making a clear bar area, stuff like that, which they're still undertaking. And they say, as of their last comment, they say that they're probably going to be finished with those by the weekend of March 3rd, at which point after that week they'll resume social activities such as rush and general parties. But it was this week that kind of month-long report on the extra degree of sexual misconduct in DKE actually came out. And I guess the idea behind that was to establish that this story right now with DKE goes a lot further than just two allegations against two former members of the fraternity. That this is an institutional problem. That there's a culture of condoning sexual misconduct potentially, and that there are really deep institutional problems that need to be addressed.
Gotcha. So kind of going off what you just said, do you think that sexual harassment is limited to DKE, or is it more of a cultural problem at Yale? Right.
Yeah. So obviously, it's certainly, I think, a cultural problem on any college campus. Right. It's certainly not exclusive to Yale, and it's certainly not exclusive to DKE. I think one of the most powerful quotes in the article earlier this week was from Helen Price, the co-founder of Unite Against Sexual Assault at Yale, another organization founded in the wake of the 2011. 2010 crisis with DKE chanting outside of the Women's Center, which her point essentially was that this Business Insider article could have been written about any fraternity at Yale, and that's something that the article touches on, right? SIGEP last year, they had a member who was suspended from Yale and expelled from the fraternity because of sexual misconduct. SIGNU a few years ago, although there was no formal complaint to the university-wide Committee on Sexual Misconduct, they were informed about sexual assault allegations about a member, and they voted to remove him. And then also, in addition to that, just very, very recently, Daniel Chinero Brashi, who is a member of LEO, formerly known as SAE at Yale, has sued the university over his 2-semester suspension for 2 counts of groping. Right. So obviously this goes a lot further than DKE, and just because this article specifically scrutinizes DKE does not mean that you could also not focus on any other fraternity at Yale and turn up very, very similar stories. The point, though, here is that DKE certainly has an institutional culture that is very, very problematic, that a lot of people are willing to talk about, even on the record, I think, which is a really significant sign of the times. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is, yes, we should be talking about this issue through the lens of DKE to a serious extent, but we should definitely not be so naive as to think that this issue stops with DKE. It's institutional to DKE, but it's also institutional to the campus-wide community as a whole.
Gotcha. So how do you foresee the university responding to these issues in the next coming months? Right.
Yeah. So today we had a really, really big story because it was at 4:57 p.m. or so, 4:47 p.m. About 5 o'clock p.m. today, Marvin Chun, Dean of Yale, Marvin Chun, announced 2 new initiatives to kind of help improve campus culture. And both of them kind of have DKE in mind. Like the second one very, very specifically has DKE in mind. First of all, there's just a new committee just being appointed, composed of various faculty members and soon to be announced student members, just generally addressing what are unsafe kind of social spaces in student organizations, and how can we make it a lot easier and less harmful for students to approach those spaces. What is an unhealthy space? And it's not just limited to sexual misconduct, it's just general unhealthy atmospheres. And that goes into the basic announcement of how do we improve campus culture.
Right.
But the second, and it's very, very significant, that they're actually the university is having someone in Yale's Title IX office specifically review the recent allegations from that Yale Daily News article earlier this week against DKE. Which is really essentially is a specific investigation towards DKE. It is Yale saying that, yes, we understand how serious this is. We do really need to look at DKE right now and figure out to what extent we can help in the situation. And it's very, very interesting going forward to see what they're going to do about it, right? If you wind back to the No Means Yes scandal and how Yale suspended Deke for 5 years from on-campus activities, that really only meant that Deke was not really able to use the Yale name next to their own, right? So like they couldn't use their Yale email addresses to advertise Deke things. They couldn't post like advertisements for Deke events or Deke recruitment around campus on like Yale billboards. Or bulletin boards rather, but I mean that's not a huge impact for Deke, right? It's not like their party stopped for 5 years or their and I would assume their recruitment was probably still doing fine, and in fact it was kind of such like a harmless, it had such a harmless effect on them that no one even realized when the 5-year ban had actually completed. Like I wrote the story last year about the 5-year ban kind of like reaching its completion like 7 months after it actually reached its completion, right? Like I came in as a freshman reporter to the Yale Daily News, and this was just like a general assignment story, but the 5-year ban had really like already expired like 7 months ago, and no one really noticed, right? Because Deke doesn't do most of the stuff they were banned from doing anyway, which literally raises the question about like what can the university do to really seriously punish Deke if they think that that's something that needs to be done. Can they sanction students against joining them? Possibly. Does that violate the freedom of association as guaranteed by the Constitution? That's something that the National Interfraternity Council is going to come at Yale very, very hard on. It's something that Deke's going to come at Yale very, very hard on, if it comes to that. That's something that Harvard's already seen a lot of pushback over. There are a lot of arguments out there about what colleges are allowed to do when it comes to specifically sanctioning universities, but it's going to be incredibly interesting going forward watching what Yale wants to do with Deke, whether or not they find the allegations to be credible, whether or not they find the general allegation of just an unhealthy culture at Deke to be credible, and what they can actually do about it, and what they're going to be willing to do about it. I think that's really the question that should be on everyone's minds right now.
Gotcha. Well, that's all the questions that I have for now. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, and thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.